Also, last chapter, we talked about some of the civil rights movements that had really gained fervor in the mid and late 1950s. We talked about Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. had um, become somewhat of a popular figure within the civil rights movement. JFK ran on the idea of improving civil rights, but he wasn't quite there to the extent as some would have wanted him to be, because even though he was a Democrat, he still had to appease Southern Democrats who wanted to push back against the civil rights movement. And of course, being a politician, you need votes to keep your office. So you kind of have to walk a fine line and maybe promote existing rules while maybe trying to soften things here and there, and then use executive orders to gain a little bit of favor here and there. And it's very precarious from that standpoint. That balance of trying to appease two different masters is very difficult. But he did openly sympathize with the civil rights movement. And upon his assassination, the political pressure that had once fallen upon JFK now had fallen onto LBJ. And of course, we just talked about his Great Society programs and what he wanted to do to improve the livelihoods of our elders and the truly destitute in our nation. But civil rights also had to be enacted. See, we still lived in a Jim Crow era, especially in the South, where you had segregation. The whole Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal mantra was challenged by Brown versus Board of Education, and calls for integration had actually now been legalized. Of course, we talked about Central High in Arkansas in 1957. As the 1960s unwound, though, you would see more and more peaceful protests emerge, especially in the South, as led by peaceful protesters and civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You had busing boycotts in Montgomery, Alabama. You have a lunch counter sit-in Greensboro, North Carolina, where black students actually sat at the lunch counter at the Woolworths department store, a restaurant, when they were not allowed to because they were black. Um, you have this idea of nonviolent protests gain steam, and to have various different publicity behind that as well to help their power and their cause. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most revered Americans, and for very good reason. Okay, MLK is, of course, that's his acronym, as he's often known, was heavily influenced by Mahatma Gandhi, who the Indian philosopher in movement towards Indian independence from the British Empire moved towards there being peaceful protest. You're going to reach people's hearts and minds and their conscience, not through acts of violence, but by helping them understand perhaps the wrongs of their ways without threatening their own well-being or their intelligence or anything else of the sort. You reach into here, okay? You just send a nonviolent message to be able to do it. Martin Luther King Jr. espoused those ideas. And he liked the idea of civil engagement via sit-ins, bus boycotts and protests and things along those lines. And he would often, he and his followers would often be arrested for trespassing and things like that, very minor offenses, okay. But in America, we have a right to protest. After all, that's how the American Revolution got started. We have a right to protest. We have a right, a constitutional right, to congregate and protest. And as long as it's kept civil and nonviolent, there is absolutely nothing wrong with protest. So, from that standpoint, okay, you have more steam going towards political movements that would end segregation. Um, Martin Luther King in 1963, just a few months before JFK was assassinated, would give his I Have a Dream speech. And I've included a link in your slideshow. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech drastically reached out to America's heart. Not just for those seeking civil rights, but for those who needed to hear a message about how we should treat one another and how every person in this country should be the right guaranteed under the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. And his vision was that all people would be able to live freely, to speak freely, and to act freely. And his message was very profound, and it reached a lot of people, and those who even vehemently disagreed. Gosh, if they didn't see the power behind his message and how he was right, it may be a lost cause. Otherwise, though, JFK's assassination did not stop the civil rights movement. It did not stop Martin Luther King, despite his arrests and his letters from Birmingham or anything else of the sort. It did not stop him from his crusade to obtain civil rights for black people. A movement towards true equality and fairness. Treat people like human beings, not like animals to be segregated in a zoo. A massive march on Washington was, Million Man March was also planned. We have thousands upon thousands of people that marched to the Washington Tower and to listen to various different addresses by people like Martin Luther King Jr. It's because of Martin Luther King Jr. and those like John Lewis, who we partnered with, and others who espouse the idea of true equality and fairness and civil rights and an end to segregation, that we would eventually see the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That, its passage is intended to undo many of the wrongs in a very long history of wrongs in American society and in American history. So, what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did, let's talk about that for a second. Basically, the Civil Rights Act, for all intents and purposes, ended de facto segregation. So it basically put an end to the Jim Crow era of separate but equal, ending specific discrimination unto black people, but it would extend to more than just black people, but it would directly affect black people in a positive way. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would now ban segregation in public places. It would also extend to various different voting rights. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Otherwise, though, you are now banning segregation in public places. It is illegal for any business, any other public place, to ban black people. Oh, you're a restaurant in Montgomery, Alabama, and you don't allow black people in your restaurant? That's now illegal. You have to legally allow black people into your establishment. Voting Rights Act largely ended segregation as we know it in our country. Doesn't stop there, though. Because one of the things, and I just alluded to this, was that, okay, you're going to end segregation in America. How do black people still vote? It was deemed at the time that there were still ways to disenfranchise the black population. So at the time, even though American citizens are guaranteed the right to vote, they can be disenfranchised. Going back to our Reconstruction days, disenfranchising black voters. By making registration for voting very difficult. Or perhaps people who cannot read must prove that they can read various different ballots in order to be able to vote. So today, in this day and age, you see a lot about voter disenfranchisement and voter identification, proving who you are, because there have been verified cases of voter fraud, and that is an obvious concern. We want to make sure that we have fair and honest elections to elect our representatives. Totally understand that. The question also raised by some people is, well, how do you do that without disenfranchising others who don't have access to a car, or maybe they don't have access to a voting booth or anything else of the sort? Especially in the coronavirus era, there's a question that's come up recently about mail-in ballots. So, as we are advised very heavily to distance ourselves from one another and stay isolated so as not to spread the virus, what do you do if there's a primary? What do you do if there's going to be a national election like we'll have in November? The idea of mail-in ballots could potentially solve some of those issues, but some people raise concerns that, well, mail-in ballots could be tampered with and otherwise increase voter fraud. I can see arguments both ways. I certainly, I certainly care about the sanctity of elections and eliminating voter fraud as best as possible. I also understand people's right to vote, and being disenfranchised is not just illegal, it's morally incorrect. So, where's the balance between the two? Well, in the 1960s, along with the civil rights movement, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was enacted to prevent black people from being able to vote. You no longer could have or eliminate their prevention. So you could no longer have verbiage that was specifically confusing. You must remove the literacy barrier from being able to vote. Various different ideas and identifications, rather, could be used to prove who you are. But in essence, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was established to eliminate voter disenfranchisement, specifically as related to black people. And the numbers of black people who registered to vote, who are now eligible and physically able to vote, would drastically increase from that point forward. So you're moving here in the 1960s, you've eliminated segregation, you're improving voting rights, giving people a fair nod. You have now improved the idea of civil rights and integration, not just of our schools, but of black people entirely. But it didn't come without detractors, and I'm not talking necessarily about white society. You see, people in black society around that time still saw poverty and violence in their inner city communities. Even though they now had done away with segregation, they were expanded with voting rights, you still had people arguing about how there are still destitute situations in our black communities. And they would often protest, and oftentimes those would become violent. Not necessarily from the protester standpoint, by the way. Oftentimes you would have various different police forces that may come in, and to squelch the protest, they might start up a fire hose. Now, I don't know what experiences you may have had with a fire hose, but I have a pressure washer hose at home with a pressure washer machine that shoots out water like 5,000 pounds per square inch PSI. That hurts. Okay. One time, just to I got the pressure washer, and I sprayed it on my hand just to see what it would feel like. I instantly regretted it because that hurt. Well, imagine a fire hose with that sort of PSI. And imagine it being sprayed upon people. Because that happened on live television. You have violence in the cities inflamed by police activity, which would cause further violence in places like Selma, Alabama, in places like Watts in south central Los Angeles, and movements all across the country would happen. The decade of the 1960s and the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights era saw massive backlash against police forces and those trying to enforce civility because they were getting out of hand. They were brutal. Not that some of these protests were right or that they weren't violent in their own nature, but the idea of police brutality really got its mark in this era. And for good reason. So you have civil disorder. And because of which, you would eventually spark a whole movement of black leaders espouse the idea of violent protest as necessary. So Martin Luther King espoused the idea of peaceful protest. Approach people's hearts, not with guns. You have other movements that would basically lean towards the idea of eliminating the idea of integration into white society. You're not going to assimilate into white society. We have our civil rights. We have voting rights. We're going to empower our race, our black race, and our distinctiveness. And we are going to resist assimilation into white society and into white culture. We are distinct. We are black, we're distinct. That was the movement behind the Black Power and messaging behind black superiority, if you will. So you have various different organizations that came up about this time in the mid to late 60s. The Black Panthers, and no, I'm not talking about Wakanda Forever in the movie, the Marvel movie, Black Panther, which is awesome, by the way. The Black Panthers were a black power movement that gained significant traction in the late 1960s and on into the 70s to espouse the idea of black distinctivism and black rights and measures of perhaps violent protest should whites or anybody deemed as being racist be seen as being out of control. This message is very distinct and different from messages like Martin Luther King. These messages come from people who reject the idea of working with whites. Why do we need to capitulate with white society? Why do we need to appease white people? We are our own. That was a message that resonated with a number of people in the civil rights movement. The Black Panthers often espoused that. And so oftentimes you would see Black Panthers march in civil rights demonstrations off with pigs. Pigs being a derogatory nickname for police. You would have other things that the Black Panthers would become involved in trying to aid poverty in the inner cities, specifically related to black people in the inner city. So they did some good. But their message was distinct. And so you have virtually a split in the civil rights movement between your Martin Luther King Jr. non-violent protesters and then your Black Power movement who was very vocal and potentially violent. They would often arm themselves with rifles and maybe even follow policemen around to make sure that they weren't beating up black people. Okay, that's definitely a different message. Otherwise, though, you have other leaders like Malcolm X, who had been arrested for larceny at one point, and in prison, he discovered Islam. And once released from prison, not only was he a Muslim, but he also became heavily involved in the civil rights movement, specifically pertaining to black people. So he largely, while behind bars, discovered the Nation of Islam, which is basically black Muslims in America. And he used that brand of black separatism, if you will, towards the civil rights movement. And he could potentially espouse violent ideas because of it. He was a captivating speaker, um, charismatic, otherwise captivating, much the same way that Martin Luther King Jr. was, just with a different ideology behind the movement. Um, Eventually, he would make a trip to Mecca on his Islamic pilgrimage, and he would have a change of heart. He would actually move towards more of Martin Luther King Jr.'s mentality before he was assassinated by people in the Nation of Islam movement who disagreed how he changed his heart. Otherwise, though, it's that sort of black power movement that also came to power at this time. So you have two different movements within civil rights, and they oppose each other.